For analysis of the first day of the 75th Annual NATO Summit, we're joined by Kervin Oakwin, former lead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance coordinator for the U.S. Army. He's also the host of the podcast This Week Explained. Good to have you with us, Kervin. What's your synopsis of the NATO Summit so far?
Well, once again, thank you for having me on to talk about this. It's been 75 years since the start of NATO, and they're celebrating that 75th year anniversary at the site that NATO was started, which is Washington, D.C. There's a lot for these leaders to get into. So, of course, Ukraine is going to be on the discussion dockets, uh, Russian deterrence, but interestingly enough, also in the Indo-Pacific. So NATO has invited other countries like Japan and South Korea, New Zealand, Australia to be part of this NATO summit to talk deterrence of China and ultimately what NATO is going to look like if at that moment that China does invade Taiwan. So it's very important, and this is coming off the heels of the debate debacle from President Joe Biden. I think these foreign leaders are going to want to have a sit down and talk with the president and make sure that you know he's running and he is competent enough to be president of the United States if he is reelected, and he has to do 4 more years.
All right, and NATO's Secretary General said yesterday the alliance's goal to spend 2% of GDP on defense will now be considered a requirement rather than an aspiration. What does this shift tell us about the alliance and the current geopolitical climate?
Yeah, there's quite a few things going on, right? The conflict in Russia, Ukraine, the China, Taiwan impact that could have globally. But the truth of the matter is, they're really looking at this U.S. presidential election, and they are hearing the words of Donald Trump, who says that if the U.S. cannot get out of NATO, they're not going to just fit the bill for NATO. The U.S. has provided in 2023 68% of funding to NATO of all the countries that have been involved, and you know, shockingly enough, there's countries like Canada and France who aren't even reaching the 2%, and they have no plan or goal to get to that 2%. So the US is saying we may not fit the bill anymore for NATO, and NATO is reacting to that right now.
And what's at stake for NATO leaders during this summit?
Well, there's a lot at stake. They would say peace in Europe, peace on the continent of Asia. There's a lot going on, but what they're really focusing on these next few days is Ukraine. Is Ukraine going to become a NATO member? There are a lot of the countries who think that Ukraine should be a NATO member. And then there are a few others that look at the corruption within Ukraine and say, I don't know if this is a good plan. So the future of NATO and where it stands in a global conflict is at stake right now, and that's really what the leaders are worried about.
Now, President Biden, in his speech yesterday, Kervin, pledged 4 Patriot air defense systems for Ukraine. What could that kind of force mean for Ukraine's war against Russia?
Well, really, it means air defense, right? So Russia's coming through and attacking certain sites. We saw the attack on the hospital in Ukraine that killed women and children. Those kind of factors are playing a large part in it. But interestingly enough, I was speaking to somebody who's at the NATO conference and was able yesterday to speak to some of the leaders and asked about, is Ukraine are they going to be released from the handcuffs that have been placed on them to now make broader attacks into Russia? And they were told as of yesterday that is not on the docket. The U.S. is not planning on allowing Ukraine to expand its attacks on Russian territory. And I think that's a very important statement that was made.
Yeah, and why do you think that's so important?
Yeah, because if a mistake happens and Ukraine uses U.S. munitions and it strikes deep within Russian territory, Vladimir Putin will use that as a red line. He's not going to sit back and allow it to happen. And while we might not have a full-scale global conflict on the European continent because of that, it is going to have Russia attack the U.S. in other ways, using proxies, cyber warfare, this advanced Cold War that we're seeing right now.
Now, Kervin, there's been a recent political shakeup in Europe, as I'm sure you're aware, a conservative upset in the UK election and France's election resulting in a fractured parliament there. Could all of that have any effect on the strength of NATO?
Yeah, it's definitely going to have an impact. Maybe not because it's more of a far left or left wing European governments that are coming into power in these countries. But what I look at it in future geopolitics is that the pendulum is going to swing back. You'll see this far left advance, and then the pendulum will swing back to far right. And Marine Le Pen from France could could get into power very soon in the next few years, and that's going to affect NATO. Yeah, she's a part of a faction that wants to do away with NATO, doesn't think it's a good for the world, and so if that pendulum swings, NATO could eventually collapse due to lack of funding.
And a key part of this conversation around NATO is Donald Trump. During his presidency, he criticized NATO members for being over-reliant on large financial contributors like the United States, as you mentioned. How could a possible incoming Trump administration affect NATO?
That's an interesting conversation to have. I think I think the media needs to keep questioning that. But look, you've got the Speaker of the House, who is a Trump supporter, who just yesterday said that NATO is a good for global security, but just reiterating that the U.S. is fitting the bill for this, and he doesn't think the U.S. should be doing that, and that I believe Trump has said this as well. European nations are going to have to start paying for NATO. It's not going to be the United States anymore. And I agree with that. I don't agree with the collapse of NATO, but spending being 68% of the funds that go to NATO coming from one country is not sustainable.
And just in closing here, what should we be watching out for as in the NATO summit today and in the rest of the week?
Yeah, it's a lot of Ukraine talk over the next 2 days. They're going to be talking about a irreversible path for Ukraine into NATO. What does that entail? And then, like I said, the Indo-Pacific is going to be a hot topic. I believe tomorrow they're going to have summits with Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, and talk about deterrence of China in invading Taiwan, but also how are these nations going to come together to secure the island of Taiwan and to push back that aggression from China.
And we'll be following it. Kervin Aucoin, thank you so much.
Thank you.